In the previous video, we talked about dynamically showing and hiding the entire component's JSX using this and returning null, or showing only a portion of the JSX, and we used this variable right here to show or hide the description within the component. Now, up to this point, we've been using a lot of dummy data to kind of show how a component might function and how it might show information that's contained within an object that this particular component is responsible for displaying. And in this case, it's a to-do item. Now, with hard-coded dummy data, it doesn't make a lot of sense because usually we're creating dynamic user interfaces that are meant to show a bunch of different to-do items, and we're passing those to-do items dynamically to the components rather than having them hard-coded. Because most of the time, this data is going to be coming from a web API or from a web service, and then we're going to dynamically begin to display it on the page. This is where a very important concept in React comes in called the props object. Now, the props object is a properties object that allows information to be passed into a component. And right here, we're dealing with a functional component. So we are going to use the props object, which will become a parameter that is passed to this functional component. And it comes in through an object. Now, you can name this object anything you want, but the standard is props, just so you know what it is. So we've got the props object right here. Now, instead of passing in this dummy to do, we're going to go ahead and delete it. And we're going to see how the props object is used to get our to-do item into the to-do item display. Now, if you notice, because we removed our dummy data right here, you will see that now our compilation fails. And that is because we are using something called a to-do here inside of our code, and yet we don't have a to-do anymore. What we're going to walk through now is how do we get this to-do inside of our component from outside of our component rather than having it hard-coded as dummy data inside of the component. This is where props comes into play. Now, to be specific, props is considered to be an immutable data structure. Now, immutable means that this particular object we should not be changing or mutating, that means altering, inside of our component. We should not be modifying this props object or any of its attributes or properties when we are modifying our code inside of our component. So that means as our code executes, it should not modify this props object. It shouldn't be adding or deleting attributes from or to it. And that's what immutable means. It's also considered to be a unidirectional data flow, meaning that the data that comes into this functional component should be coming one direction. It should be coming from outside the component into the component, and we should not be adding data to the props in the hopes that that data would get passed back out. In other words, data only flows one direction, and that is from outside the component to inside the component through the props object. We do not add data to the props object and then try to push it back out. It doesn't work that way. Now the question is, how do we pass data into our component from outside of our component, and how do we get that data into this props object? Well, that's taken care of for us by React. So all the underlying plumbing is handled by React. And really, once we have this props object passed to our component, when our component gets initialized, we then have the ability to access any properties that were added to this props object by React. Now the question is, how do properties get added, or how do attributes get added to this props object? Well, that is done through Jsx Attributes. Now remember, we talked about the fact that JSX is not necessarily HTML, but it looks very much like HTML, and it gets compiled into HTML by React, and then that's what ends up in our browser. Well, with that, because HTML allows us to add attributes, such as class name or href or title or any of those, ID, JSX allows us to add our own custom properties to our JSX, and those custom properties are what get added to the props object when a particular component is created. Now, where do we use this component? Well, right now we're using it in our app.js. So right here in app.js. Now this, of course, as we've already talked about, is JSX. And so is this to-do item display, because it is imported right here from our to-do item display.js, which we were just looking at. And it comes in as a React component, but when we use it inside of the JSX of another component, when this gets compiled and then embedded into this component, it of course is JSX, because it's JSX that is getting returned right here from our to-do item display. So its JSX gets embedded inside of this component's JSX, and then when this all gets finally rendered and injected into our index.html, we then have regular old HTML. So the way we pass properties into the props object so that we can access it inside of our custom component is simply by adding a custom attribute to our component's JSX. So here we're using the to-do item display, and we would give it a custom attribute. And in this case, it's a to-do item. So we'll say to-do equals, and then inside of our curly braces, we're going to pass a to-do item. Now we're going to leave our dummy data list right here until we get to the point that we are implementing other features of our to-do application. But for now, we're just going to pass this first to-do items to-do. So the first to-do in the to-do items list, we're going to pass that one to our component right here. So let's go ahead and do that right here. So it is going to be at index 0 of our to-do items array. So we're going to pass that. So let's do to-do items, and then we're going to pass the 0 index. We're going to save that. And we're seeing that we still are failing our compiling. And that is because although we are now passing the to-do as a property of our to-do item, as a new custom attribute, what's happened is that in our display item, we're still not pulling it out of props yet. So to be clear, this to-do attribute, which now holds a reference to the first to-do inside of our to-do items list. In other words, it holds a reference to this object. This to-do actually gets added to the props object that gets passed to our to-do item component. And if to make that, to help that make sense, we can see that the props object is right here. And since we are adding this attribute right here, right here, with a reference to that first to-do item, we can expect that we can call props.todo, because that is the name we used for that attribute. We should be able to say props.todo and actually get this to compile now. So let's go ahead and take props, and wherever we had to do, let's just do props dot. So props dot everywhere where we used to do. So we used it here to check to see if it was complete. We used it here to get the name out, and we used it here to get the description out. Now once I save this, we should see it compiled down here without an issue. And if we go back to our HTML, we should see to-do item 1. And to verify that that really is the to-do item that we are passing, I'm going to say to-do item 1, and then I'm going to say updated. And if we come back here, you will see the to-do item 1 dash updated. Oops, I spelt it wrong. Updated. Updated. All right, so here we can see that this to-do item display is now using the first to-do item. And just to show this, we can actually copy this. And instead of the to-do items, and instead of grabbing the first one in the array, we'll grab the second one, or at the first index. We'll save it, come back, and we should see to-do item 1 updated, and then to-do item 2. Here you can see that we are actually putting 2 of our to-do items inside of our application. This goes to show that this to-do item component is reusable. In other words, it is not specific to one to-do item. Instead, it is a component that is in charge of displaying any to-do item that gets passed to it, whether it be the first, second, third, or fourth. And here we are rendering the first one on the list and the second one on the list, and this is what we're getting. And just for the fun of it, we can kick down another one and add the third item in the list. And here we got to-do item 1, to-do item 2, and to-do item 3. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this updated here so that it's not all crazy looking. You should see it updated. And now we've got 3 of them. Awesome. So hopefully you understand now how we pass data into a component using custom attributes. And those custom attributes become properties of the props object that is passed by React to a new instance of our to-do item display component. So each time the to-do item is used, a new instance of that component is created. The to-do item is referenced and then added to the props object that is then passed to the instance of the to-do item display that is being called right here. And we get a different to-do item display component for each to-do item. And they each get a props object with a to-do item attached to them. And the to-do attribute of the props is the exact same name as whatever we called that custom attribute. To show this, I can change this to-do. So let's get rid of these 2. And since we're using to-do, sometimes that can be confusing for people. So let's go ahead and change this to entity. And we'll just call it entity instead. Now with it called entity, when we go to our UI, you can see we're getting errors. Props.todo, we're getting an error on that because props.todo is undefined. It can't find the property complete of undefined. And that is because we just changed the name of the property that gets attached to the props object that gets passed to the component. And instead of to-do, it's now called entity. And entity now holds a reference to that to-do. So back here in our component, if we're going to use entity as the attribute name, we are going to have to change it everywhere where we used to-do. Once we do that, we save, we come back, we should see a to-do item. So hopefully that gives you a very clear understanding that the props dot and then the name of the custom attribute that we used to reference an object is what has to be used inside of your component. Now I'm going to change these all back to to-do because to-do makes a lot more sense than entity. And I'm going to change this back to to-do because that makes a lot more sense. And now we're back to it all working just fine.